He paid $75,000 for an abandoned battleship island that everyone said was worthless, a graveyard of rusted metal and forgotten wars. But hidden beneath the concrete and decay was a secret worth over $320 million, a fortune that would change his life, expose a decades-old cover-up, and remind the world that sometimes the most broken places hold the most extraordinary treasures. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The fluorescent lights at the county assessor's office flickered like they were trying to give up, casting an uneven glow across the scratched linoleum floor that had probably been installed sometime during the Nixon administration. Marcus Reed sat alone in a plastic chair that had seen better decades, his left leg stretched out at an awkward angle, the way it always sat now, the way it had sat since Kandahar. His cane rested against his knee, worn smooth, where his palm gripped it 1,000 times a day, the rubber tip at the bottom nearly gone from years of supporting weight. His leg could no longer fully bear. He was 38 years old, but his body felt twice that, held together by surgical pins, prescription bottles that rattled in his medicine cabinet, like accusations, and sheer stubbornness that the VA psychiatrist kept calling maladaptive coping mechanisms. The auction catalog lay open on his lap, dog-eared and coffee-stained, creased from being folded and unfolded so many times. The pages had gone soft as fabric. Most of the listings were unremarkable, the kind of forgotten properties that ended up in government auctions, because nobody wanted them and nobody remembered to care. Tax-delinquent strip malls with 4 Lees signs sun-faded to ghosts. Foreclosed ranch land where the soil had given up trying. A warehouse with a collapsed roof that looked like a giant had stepped on it and walked away. Marcus had circled a few out of boredom, mostly just to feel like he was doing something, like he had purpose on a Thursday morning, when most men his age were at real jobs, doing real work. But one entry had caught his eye 3 weeks ago and hadn't let go since, like a fishhook buried deep where you couldn't reach it. Lot 47. Military Island Installation. Decommissioned 1,973, approximately 12 acres. Structures include battleship hull sections, concrete bunkers, observation towers. No utilities. No access except by boat. Minimum bid, $50,000. Warning: property may contain hazardous materials, unexploded ordnance, and structural instability. Buyer assumes all liability. The grainy photograph showed a dark shape rising from gray water like something from another world. All sharp angles and rust. Massive steel plates jutting from concrete foundations at angles that shouldn't have been possible. The island looked angry somehow, like it was still fighting a war that had ended before Marcus was born. Most people would have turned the page without a second glance, dismissed it as government junk not worth the headache. But Marcus had stared at that photograph for an hour the first time he saw it, something in his chest tightening in a way he hadn't felt since before the IED that had turned his left leg into a jigsaw puzzle of titanium and regret. He'd shown it to his daughter, Riley, over breakfast that Saturday morning. She was 16 now, sharp as her mother had been, with the same skeptical eyebrow raise that used to make Marcus laugh back when laughter came easier, before everything got heavy. She had her mother's eyes too, dark, brown, and clear, the kind of eyes that saw through bullshit and loved you anyway. "Dad," she'd said, pouring cereal with the exasperation only a teenager could muster, milk splashing over Cheerios like she was attacking them. "That's literally a pile of junk in the middle of nowhere. You can't even see it from shore." It's history, Marcus had replied quietly, running his finger over the photograph, like it might reveal something new if he touched it right. It's a tetanus shot waiting to happen. She'd crunched her cereal loudly, then softened when she saw his face, the way he studied that photograph like it held answers to questions he'd stopped asking out loud. "Dad, you okay?" Riley knew her father had been searching for something since he came home from the war. Since her mother died 2 years after that from cancer that ate through her faster than any of them could process. Maybe not purpose exactly, but proof. Proof that there was still something left for him to build, to fix, to matter. Proof that he wasn't just a broken man, collecting disability checks and stocking shelves at the hardware store 3 days a week, because that's all his leg could handle. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he'd said. Which was what he always said, which they both knew wasn't entirely true. "Just thinking about buying a death trap island," she'd said. But she'd smiled a little, that small upturn at the corner of her mouth that meant she wasn't really mad, just worried. "You know we can't afford this, right? That's like all your savings." "I know," Marcus had admitted, "but sometimes you have to take a risk on something everyone else has given up on. Sometimes broken things are worth more than people think." Riley had looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him, seeing past the words to what he wasn't saying, that he was talking about himself as much as the island, that he needed this in a way that had nothing to do with logic or financial sense. "Then I guess we're island owners now," she'd said quietly, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. Her fingers were thin, still growing, but her grip was strong. "Just promise me you won't die out there, okay? Because I'm way too young to be an orphan, and I suck at cooking anything that isn't microwave pizza." Marcus had laughed, actually laughed, and promised. Now, sitting in the assessor's office 3 weeks later, he wondered if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, or the smartest decision he'd never planned. The auction started at 10 o'clock sharp. Only a handful of people showed up, mostly developers in expensive suits who smelled like cologne and condescension, their leather portfolios thick with financing documents and investment strategies. They barely glanced at Marcus in his worn jeans and Marine Corps hoodie, the one with the frayed cuffs he couldn't bring himself to throw away, even though Riley kept hiding it in the back of the closet. To them, he was invisible, just another small town, nobody, wasting everyone's time. The auction room itself was depressing in that special way government buildings manage to be. All beige walls and industrial carpet that had absorbed decades of disappointed size. A folding table at the front held a laptop and a portable speaker system that crackled with static. The auctioneer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice like gravel being poured into a bucket, moved through the lots with mechanical efficiency, his tone suggesting he'd rather be literally anywhere else. Lots 1 through 15 went quickly, snapped up by developers who barely looked up from their phones as they bid. A strip mall went for $80,000. Some farmland went for $200. Nobody seemed excited. This was just business. Just another Thursday turning distressed properties into profit margins. When the auctioneer reached lot 47, the room grew even quieter than before. If that was possible. A few of the developers actually closed their portfolios, signaling they were done for the day. "Military island installation," the auctioneer announced without enthusiasm, not even trying to sell it. "Lot 47. Decommissioned government property approximately 12 miles offshore." Buyer assumes all liability, all hazardous materials, all structures as is. Federal waivers must be signed. No warranties implied or given. Property sold in present condition with all faults. He adjusted his glasses. Minimum bid $50,000. Silence filled the room like something physical, pressing down on everyone. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt sweat gathering at the back of his neck, despite the air conditioning that made the room feel like a meat locker. His hand started to rise before his brain could argue, before the logical part of him could list all the reasons this was insane. 50,000, he said, voice steady despite his racing pulse, despite the developer 2 rows ahead, who actually turned around to see who was stupid enough to bid on garbage. The auctioneer peered over his glasses at Marcus, probably wondering if this was a joke. 50,000 from bidder 19. Do I hear 55? Sign send time. 75. No one moved. The developers were already packing up, shaking their heads, whispering to each other. One of them, a guy in his 50s with slicked back hair and a watch that probably cost more than Marcus's truck, smirked and muttered to his colleague loud enough for the room to hear. Sucker just bought a floating scrapyard. Hope he's got a good tetanus shot. His friend laughed, the kind of laugh that said they'd already forgotten about Marcus and moved on to their next deal. The auctioneer waited the obligatory time. 50,000 going once. A pause that felt like an eternity. Going twice. Marcus held his breath, wondering if someone would swoop in at the last second, some developer who'd been playing it cool, and would now steal this away from him. The gavel came down with a crack that echoed off the beige walls. Sold to bidder 19 for $50,000. Just like that, it was his. Marcus sat there for a moment, unable to move, unable to fully process what he'd just done. He'd just spent every penny he'd saved over 3 years. Money he'd scraped together from his disability checks and his part-time work. Money that was supposed to be for emergencies, or Riley's college, or fixing the transmission on his truck when it finally gave up. Instead, he'd bought an island nobody wanted. The smirking developer shook his head as he walked past Marcus toward the exit. Good luck with that, Chief, he said, not unkindly, just stating what he considered an obvious fact. You're gonna need it. Marcus didn't respond. He'd learned a long time ago, back in boot camp and then in actual combat, that some people couldn't see value in broken things. They'd never had to become one. Never had to rebuild themselves from pieces that didn't quite fit together anymore. Never had to prove to the world and themselves that just because something was damaged didn't mean it was worthless. The paperwork took 3 hours, which felt longer than the actual auction. Liability waivers stacked an inch thick. Environmental disclosures that read like horror novels. Pages and pages of warnings about structural instability, unexploded ordnance, hazardous materials, contaminated water, toxic soil, unstable foundations, and basically every other way the island might kill him. Marcus signed them all, his hand cramping by the end, while the clerk, a tired woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a world's okay yes ma'am mug on her desk, watched with increasing concern. You sure about this, hun? She asked softly when they got to the final document, sliding it across the desk slowly, like she was giving him one last chance to run. I've been processing these auctions for 20 years, and I gotta tell you, I've never seen anyone buy one of these military islands. They usually just sit there until the government figures out what to do with them. Which is basically never. Marcus looked down at the deed. at his name printed next to words like sole owner and in perpetuity, and felt something shift in his chest. For the first time since he'd come home from the war, since he'd buried his wife, since he'd started waking up every morning wondering what the point was, he felt something that might have been hope. "Yeah," he said, signing the last line. "I'm sure." The clerk stamped the document with a heavy, approved stamp that sounded like a prison door closing or opening, depending on how you looked at it. "Well then, congratulations, Mr. Reed. You're now the proud owner of 12 acres of potential catastrophe." She smiled to show she was kidding. "Mostly. Just promise me, you'll be careful out there. My husband was Navy. I know what these old installations can be like." That night, Marcus drove home to the small rental house he shared with Riley on the edge of town, the deed sitting on the passenger seat like a passenger he wasn't sure he wanted. The place was modest, a 2-bedroom bungalow with vinyl siding and a yard he kept meaning to mow but never quite got around to. It was clean, though, held together by his disability checks and Riley's determination to make sure they had something that felt like home, even if it wasn't much. She'd hung photos on the walls, planted flowers in the beds out front, turned the garage into a workshop where Marcus fixed things for neighbors sometimes when his leg was having a good day. Riley was at the kitchen table doing homework when he walked in, her textbooks spread out like battle plans, highlighters in 4 different colors, organizing information in ways that made sense to her teenage brain. Chemistry tonight, based on the periodic table wallpaper on her laptop screen. She looked up when the door opened, and Marcus saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. "How'd it go?" Her voice was carefully neutral, like she was trying not to hope or worry too much either way. "I bought it," Marcus said, setting the deed on the kitchen counter like it might explode. Her pen stopped moving mid-equation. She looked at him, really looked, searching his face for regret or fear or excitement. "You're serious? You actually did it? 75,000 total with fees and taxes," Marcus said, the number still not feeling real even as he said it out loud. "Every penny I saved. Plus, I had to get insurance, which apparently costs extra when your property might explode." Riley closed her textbook slowly, carefully. For a long moment she just stared at him, and Marcus felt his stomach clench, waiting for her to yell or cry or tell him he'd lost his mind, which would have been fair because he was pretty sure he had. Instead, she stood up and walked over and hugged him, quick and tight, her thin arms surprisingly strong around his middle. She was almost as tall as him now. When had that happened? This girl who used to fit in the crook of his arm. "Then I guess we're island owners now," she whispered against his shoulder. Marcus held her close, feeling the weight lift just slightly, the weight he'd been carrying since her mother died, since the war ended, since the world decided he was broken and filed him away like those tax-delinquent properties nobody wanted to think about. "Guess we are," he said. And for the first time, in a long time, he meant it when he smiled. The first time Marcus saw the island in person. The morning mist clung to the water like it was trying to hide something, like the ocean itself was keeping a secret. It was 2 days after the auction, early enough that the sun was still just a suggestion on the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that would have been beautiful if Marcus wasn't so nervous his hands were shaking. He'd hired a local fisherman named Cal to ferry him across. A grizzled man in his 60s who'd seen everything the ocean had to offer and wasn't impressed by much. Cal's boat was old but well-maintained, a 30-foot fishing vessel that smelled like diesel fuel and old rope. and something Marcus couldn't quite identify but suspected was decades of accumulated sea stories. "That's it," Cal said around the cigarette, permanently affixed to the corner of his mouth, pointing through the fog with one weathered hand while the other stayed steady on the wheel. His voice was rough, worn down by salt air and too much yelling over engine noise. The island emerged slowly from the mist like something being born, a dark silhouette against the pale sky. And as they got closer, as the details began to resolve through the fog, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The photographs hadn't done it justice, hadn't captured the sheer scale of what he was looking at. The massive hull sections of a decommissioned battleship rose from the concrete foundation, like the bones of some ancient beast, some metal leviathan that had been dragged from the deep and left to die in the air. Rust covered every surface in shades of orange and brown and deep crimson, bleeding down into the rocks below like the island itself was wounded. Gun turrets jutted at odd angles, their barrels pointed at nothing, frozen in permanent vigilance against enemies that no longer existed. Observation towers leaned like broken teeth, their windows shattered, their stairs hanging loose. The whole place looked angry, forgotten, and utterly unforgiving, like it had been at war with time itself and was losing badly. "You sure you want to do this?" Cal asked, cutting the engine as they approached the remains of a dock that looked about as trustworthy as a politician's promise. "I've been fishing these waters 40 years, and I've never once seen anyone go out to that place. There's a reason it's abandoned, Marcus." Marcus grabbed his cane and his backpack, everything he'd brought for a full day of exploration. Water, energy bars, first aid kit, flashlight, camera, notebook, and the deed itself, because part of him still couldn't quite believe he owned this place. "Yeah, I'm sure. The dock was barely holding together, planks missing like teeth knocked out in a fight, ropes rotted through to nothing but memory. Marcus stepped carefully, testing each board before putting his weight down, his cane finding purchase in gaps and cracks. His leg ached in the cold, sending sharp reminders up his spine that metal and bone don't always cooperate, especially in damp weather. He ignored them the same way he'd learned to ignore most pain over the past 5 years, by moving forward anyway, by pretending that stubbornness was the same thing as strength. Cal called out from the boat, already drifting back a safe distance. "I'll be back at 1500 hours, 3 o'clock. You're not here. I'm leaving without you. Can't be out here after dark. Tides get nasty, and I ain't risking my boat for nobody." "Fair enough," Marcus called back, watching as the boat pulled away, engine coughing to life. Within minutes, Cal had disappeared back into the mist, and Marcus was alone with the wind, the waves, and 12 acres of forgotten military history. He stood at the edge of the dock for a long moment, his cane planted firmly in a crack between boards, and looked up at the island proper. A concrete path, cracked and overgrown with stubborn weeds that had fought their way through solid stone, led up from the water to the main structures. Everything was bigger than he'd imagined, bigger than the photographs had suggested. The battleship sections towered 3 stories high in places, massive plates of steel welded to reinforced foundations that had probably been poured during World War II. During the war and after, this place had been a weapons testing facility, a training ground, a strategic outpost where young sailors learned how to kill and hopefully not get killed. Now it was a graveyard, a monument to obsolescence, a place where the past went to be forgotten. Marcus started walking, his cane clicking against concrete with each step, echoing off metal walls in a rhythm that was both lonely and oddly comforting. His leg protested every incline, every uneven surface, but he pushed through it. He'd walked on worse, crawled on worse, dragged himself through Afghan dirt with worse. The first building he entered was some kind of barracks, long and narrow, with rows of rusted bed frames standing like skeletal soldiers, and lockers standing open like empty mouths, screaming silently at nothing. Graffiti covered the walls, layered decades deep, different generations of trespassers leaving their marks. Kilroy was here from what looked like the 70s, various names and dates, crude drawings, and one that made Marcus pause. We trained here to defend freedom. What was it all for? He didn't have an answer for that. He'd asked himself the same question 1,000 times since Kandahar. Water damage had turned the ceiling into an abstract painting of brown stains and hanging insulation, long strips of fiberglass dangling like entrails. But underneath all the decay, Marcus could see the craftsmanship, the attention to detail that military engineers had once poured into this place. The concrete walls were 2 feet thick. The window frames were reinforced steel. This place had been built to last, to withstand bombing runs and artillery fire if necessary. It had lasted, just not the way anyone intended. He moved through methodically, taking photos with his phone, even though he had no signal out here, making notes in his waterproof notebook, cataloging everything. There were workshops with ancient tools still hanging on pegboards, their wooden handles cracked but their metal still solid. A mess hall with tables bolted to the floor, plates and cups long gone but the ghosts of 1,000 meals still lingering somehow in the air. A control room with panels, stripped of anything valuable, just empty housings and severed wires, hanging like nerve endings from a brain that no longer worked. Everywhere he looked, Marcus saw both destruction and potential. Water damage could be fixed, rust could be treated, broken windows could be replaced. This place could be restored, could be turned into something. He wasn't sure what yet, but something. A museum, maybe, or a memorial, or just a project that gave him a reason to wake up in the morning. 3 hours in, as the sun finally burned through the morning mist and filled the empty buildings with pale light, Marcus found the stairs. They were tucked behind a collapsed section of wall in what looked like an administrative building, the kind of place where officers would have worked, where orders would have been written and filed and forgotten. The entrance had been sealed with a heavy steel door, military grade, the kind designed to keep people out or keep them in depending on which side you were on. But time and rust had done their work, corrosion eating through the lock mechanism, hinges weakening under decades of salt air. The door hung at an angle, one corner dragging on the floor, creating a gap just wide enough for Marcus to see darkness beyond. He pulled on the handle experimentally. The door groaned, metal scraping against concrete, a sound like bones grinding together. It moved easier than he expected, swinging open with a screech that echoed through the empty building and out into the open air beyond. Beyond was darkness, absolute and complete. His flashlight beam cut through it like a solid thing, revealing stairs descending into the earth, each step worn smooth in the center from countless feet that had walked this path decades ago. The stairs went down, down, deeper than Marcus had expected, past where the first floor should have ended, past where he thought the water line might be. The air that drifted up from below was cold and heavy, tinged with salt and something else, something metallic that Marcus couldn't quite identify, but that made his instincts honed by 12 years in the Marines and 3 tours in combat zones, suddenly scream warnings his conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet. He stood at the top of those stairs, one hand on the rusted railing, his cane in the other, his flashlight beam unable to reach the bottom no matter how he angled it. Every tactical instinct he'd ever learned told him to be careful, to assess, to call for backup, to not go down there alone. But another part of him, the part that had bought this island in the first place, the part that was tired of playing it safe and watching life happen to other people, while he collected disability checks and pretended that was enough, whispered something different. This is why you're here. This is what you've been looking for. Marcus Reed took a breath, adjusted his grip on his cane, and descended into the dark, leaving the sunlight behind, not knowing he was about to discover something that would change everything, not knowing that his $75,000 gamble was about to turn into the find of a lifetime, not knowing that the real treasure wasn't gold or jewels, but the purpose he'd been searching for since the day an IED in Afghanistan had turned his world upside down and taught him that sometimes you have to descend into darkness before you can find light. The stairs seemed endless, switchback after switchback, each step taking him deeper beneath the island, deeper into silence, broken only by the sound of his breathing and the tap of his cane and the distant drip of water from somewhere unseen. And at the bottom, waiting in darkness complete, was a door unlike any he'd seen above, sealed and solid, and marked with words he had to lean close to read, words that made his heart start to race and his hands start to shake. Authorized personnel only. Section 7. Storage. Marcus stood in front of that door for a long time, knowing somehow that opening it would change everything, knowing that whatever was stored behind it had been waiting 50 years for someone to find it, knowing that his life was balanced on this moment like a coin spinning in the air. And all he had to do was push. He pushed. The door groaned open with the kind of sound that suggested it hadn't moved in decades. Metal scraping against stone, hinges protesting their sudden awakening. Marcus's flashlight beam cut through the darkness beyond, revealing another staircase, this one descending even deeper into the bedrock of the island. The air that rushed out was cold and dry, preserved somehow, like opening a tomb that had been sealed since the pharaohs walked the earth. It carried that same metallic scent he'd noticed before, stronger now, mixed with something else he couldn't quite identify, but that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Marcus descended carefully, one hand trailing along the rough stone wall, the other gripping his cane so tightly his knuckles went white. His legs screamed with each step, the old shrapnel wounds protesting the uneven terrain and the cold that seemed to seep up from below like the island itself was exhaling winter. The stairs switchbacked 3 times, 4 times, 5, taking him so deep beneath the surface he lost count, lost track of depth, lost any sense of how far down he'd gone. Finally, mercifully, the stairs ended. Marcus found himself standing in a chamber that took his breath away. It wasn't natural, this space. It had been carved, shaped, engineered by human hands and machinery decades ago. The ceiling arched overhead, disappearing into shadow beyond his flashlight's reach, easily 50 feet across, maybe more. The walls were rough stone, but reinforced at intervals with concrete pillars and steel beams that looked military-grade. Overbuilt in that way the government used to engineer things when budgets were limitless, and the Cold War made paranoia a virtue. His flashlight swept across the space, catching glints of metal, the edges of what looked like equipment crates stacked against far walls. and most arrestingly, a series of heavy doors built into the stone itself. They looked like bank vault doors, circular and imposing, each one marked with stenciled numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They stood like silent sentinels, guardians of whatever secrets this place held. Marcus moved deeper into the chamber, his footsteps echoing in ways that suggested the space was even larger than it appeared, his cane tapping out a lonely rhythm against smooth concrete floor. Someone had poured this floor, leveled it, sealed it. This wasn't some natural cave they discovered and repurposed. This was a facility, purpose-built, designed to hide something important enough to bury 2 levels beneath an already forgotten military installation. Against the near wall, he found what looked like a command station. A desk of heavy wood, now warped with time but still solid, flanked by filing cabinets made of steel that had resisted the years better than anything above ground. Marcus approached cautiously, half expecting the desk to collapse the moment he touched it, but it held firm. The drawers were locked, heavy mechanical locks that looked like they'd come from a bank, the kind designed in an era before electronic security made everything both easier and more fragile. He tried each drawer methodically, pulling, jiggling, hoping for one that had rusted open or been left unlocked by whoever last worked here. The first 4 held firm, but the 5th, the bottom drawer on the right side, moved slightly when he pulled. Not open, but not fully locked either, like the mechanism had partially failed or been deliberately left accessible. Marcus set down his cane and pulled harder, putting his weight into it, feeling the old lock mechanism grinding inside the drawer. Something gave with a metallic snap that echoed through the chamber, and the drawer slid open 6 inches before catching on something inside. He reached in carefully, mindful of sharp edges and whatever might have made a home in this darkness over the decades, and pulled out what was blocking it. A leather folder, thick and heavy, the kind military officers used to carry before everything went digital. It was marked with faded stamps, confidential in red ink that had bled into the leather over time, and below that, in careful block letters, Section 7 Storage Facility, authorized personnel only. Marcus's hands trembled as he set it on the desk, brushing away decades of dust that rose in a cloud and made him cough. He opened the folder carefully, half expecting the pages inside to disintegrate at his touch. But whatever leather and paper they'd used in the 1970s had been built to last. Inside were maps, detailed blueprints of the entire island, every building, every bunker, every tunnel system labeled and cross-referenced. And there, marked, clearly in blue ink, was the chamber where he now stood, labeled in neat handwriting, Secure Storage, Asset, Protection, Protocol. The vault chamber was clearly marked with its 6 numbered doors, exactly as he'd found them. But what made Marcus's breath catch were the handwritten notes in the margins, cramped writing in different colors of ink, suggesting multiple authors over time, updates and observations added across years or maybe decades. Transfer delayed pending federal authorization. One note read, dated November 1972. Assets confirmed and catalogued, await transport. Read another from January 1973. And then, in different handwriting, more recent but still decades old, project terminated. Transfer cancelled indefinitely. Assets to remain in situ, pending future federal review. That last note was dated March 1973, and there was nothing after it. No follow-up, no resolution, just Marcus sat heavily in the old desk chair, which groaned but held, and tried to process what he was reading. During and after World War II, he knew from history, classes, and military briefings, the United States had seized massive quantities of assets from enemy nations. Gold, artwork, jewelry, historical artifacts, anything of value that could be used for war reparations, or returned to rightful owners, or sold to fund reconstruction. Some of it had been handled properly, documented, returned, or distributed according to international agreements. But some of it, particularly items of disputed ownership or unclear provenance, had been placed in what the government called protective custody at secure military facilities, while lawyers and bureaucrats fought over who owned what and which country got which piece of stolen heritage back. His island had been one of those facilities, and based on these notes, the protective custody had turned into something else entirely. Abandonment. The transfer had been delayed, then cancelled, and then, it seemed, simply forgotten. The people who knew about it had retired or died or been reassigned. The facility had been decommissioned, and the assets they were supposed to protect had become ghosts. Paperwork lost in filing cabinets, storage fees unpaid, bureaucratic loose ends that nobody had bothered to tie up. Marcus spent the next hour reading through every document in that folder, photographing pages with his phone. Even though he had no signal this deep underground, no way to back anything up, no way to prove what he was seeing, except his own eyes and the camera roll that might not survive if he dropped his phone or the battery died. There were inventory lists, partial and incomplete, suggesting the full records were stored elsewhere. Asset descriptions in military shorthand that meant nothing to him. Item 7-34 gold ingot, standard weight. Origin Japan. Item 12-18 ceremonial artifact. Origin Germany. Historical significance high. And there were photographs, old Polaroids paper-clipped to typed pages, showing various items, gold bars stacked like bricks, jewelry laid out on tables, ornate boxes, weapons, artwork. Each photo had been carefully labeled, dated, assigned a storage location within the vault system. Most importantly, he found a hand-drawn map, more detailed than the blueprints, showing the internal layout of each vault. Vault 1 through Vault 6, each containing different categories of assets. The map showed dimensions, shelf layouts, even notes about environmental controls that had apparently been installed to preserve sensitive items. Whoever had created this map had been meticulous, obsessive even, determined to leave a record that would survive. At the bottom of the folder, tucked into a pocket Marcus almost missed, was a smaller envelope, marked simply, "In case of emergency, Building 7. Building 7. Marcus pulled out the main blueprints and searched for it. There, on the southern edge of the island, a structure he hadn't explored yet, partially collapsed according to the drawings, marked as an auxiliary command post. The envelope was sealed, old wax that crumbled when he touched it, and inside was a single key on a chain, and a note written in the same careful handwriting as the map. If you're reading this, then something has gone wrong. The assets in Section 7 were meant to be temporary storage pending proper distribution. If that hasn't happened, if these vaults have been abandoned, Then there are records in Building 7 that will explain everything. God help us if we've left this here to rot while families wait for what's rightfully theirs. Captain James Morrison, Officer in Charge, Section 7 Operations, December 1972. Marcus read that note 3 times, feeling the weight of it, the desperation in those words. Captain Morrison had known something was wrong, had known the system was failing, and had tried to leave breadcrumbs for whoever came after. 50 years later, Marcus was following them. He looked at the vault doors, standing silent and imposing in the shadows. The key in his hand was small, too small for those massive doors. This was a key to something else, something in Building 7. The vaults themselves would need to wait. Marcus climbed back up those endless stairs, his leg protesting every step, emerged into the administrative building where sunlight now streamed through broken windows, and checked his watch. Noon. He had 3 hours before Cal returned. 3 hours to find Building 7 and whatever Captain Morrison had left behind. The southern edge of the island was rougher terrain, more exposed to weather, less maintained even during its operational years. Building 7 turned out to be what Marcus had initially dismissed as a collapsed watchtower. Half of it tumbled into the rocks below, the other half barely standing, choked with vines and bird nests, and the determined vegetation that always finds a way to reclaim human construction. Getting inside required crawling through a gap in the wall where the original entrance had been blocked by fallen concrete. Marcus's legs screamed at him, his cane useless here, forced to drag himself through on his belly like he'd done in Afghanistan, like his body remembered even when his mind tried to forget. Inside was darkness, and the smell of bird droppings and rotted wood and salt air that had been circulating for decades. His flashlight revealed a small room, maybe 15 feet square, mostly empty, except for debris and animal nests. But against the far wall, hidden behind a sheet of plywood that had somehow remained propped up all these years, was another door, smaller, reinforced, with a keyhole that looked like it would match the key Morrison had left. Marcus pulled the plywood aside, sending mice scattering and disturbing nests that exploded into feathers and twigs. He brushed decades of dirt from the door's surface, revealing stenciled words, record storage, authorized access only. The key fit perfectly. The lock turned with surprising smoothness, suggesting it had been maintained longer than anything else on the island, or maybe just built so well that time couldn't touch it. The door opened inward, revealing not a room but a tunnel, concrete-lined, leading downward at a gentle slope. Marcus followed it, the tunnel running underground for what felt like 100 yards, parallel to the shoreline, emerging finally in a small concrete bunker built into the rocks themselves, completely hidden from above, accessible only through the tunnel he'd just traversed. It was dry inside, surprisingly clean, and along one wall stood metal shelves holding wooden crates, each marked with serial numbers and dates. He approached the nearest crate and pried it open carefully, the old nails giving way with minimal effort. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them perfectly, were documents. Thousands of pages, neatly organized in folders, manila envelopes, binders. This was the archive, the complete record Captain Morrison had been keeping. Marcus pulled out folder after folder, his hands shaking now not from cold but from the sheer magnitude of what he was seeing. Detailed manifests listing every asset stored in the Section 7 vaults. Item by item, weight by weight, origin by origin. Authenticity certificates for artwork and historical pieces. Provenance documents, tracing ownership. Photographs of every single item, multiple angles, detailed shots. This wasn't just an inventory. It was a museum-quality catalogue, the kind of documentation that would satisfy any court or historical society or government agency. And at the bottom of the third crate, in a leather binder that looked more official than anything else, Marcus found what made his heart stop. A ledger, bound professionally, with asset valuation, Section 7 storage facility, embossed on the cover. He opened it with trembling hands. The pages were filled with careful calculations, values assigned to each category of asset, subtotals, and totals carefully noted in blue ink. Gold bullion by weight and purity. Jewelry by type and estimated worth. Artwork by artist and historical significance. Artifacts by rarity and cultural importance. Page after page of items that had been seized during the war. Documented, valued, and then apparently forgotten. Marcus flipped to the final page, to the summary section, and felt the world tilt. Total asset value, as calculated December 1972, $323,472,000. Below that, in parentheses, a note, conservative estimate based on current market values. Actual value may exceed this figure significantly, depending on historical significance and collector demand. $323 million. In $1,972. Marcus's mind raced, trying to calculate inflation, trying to account for the increase in gold prices over 50 years, trying to comprehend numbers that didn't make sense, numbers that couldn't be real. He'd bought the island for $75,000. Everything in the vaults, he'd owned it all the moment that gavel fell at the auction. Abandoned government property on land he legally possessed. $323 million. Probably worth triple that now, maybe more, sitting in sealed vaults beneath his feet, forgotten for half a century. While the world moved on and families mourned, lost heritage, and museums kept empty spaces in their catalogues for artwork that would never return. Marcus sat down hard on the bunker floor, the ledger open in his lap, and let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He'd been searching for purpose, for meaning, for something to care about, beyond his own pain and disability checks, and the slow, grinding emptiness of post-war life. He'd bought a broken island because something in him recognized broken things and wanted to fix them, wanted to prove they had value. He'd found more than value. He'd found responsibility, because as he sat there, reading through more documents, understanding the scope of what Captain Morrison had tried to protect, Marcus realized something crucial. This wasn't treasure in the pirates and adventure sense. This was history. These were items that had been stolen during wartime, seized from families and museums and cultural institutions, meant to be returned or preserved. The fact that they'd been abandoned by the government didn't make them his by right. It made them his by obligation. He found letters in the files, correspondence between Captain Morrison and various government departments, increasingly desperate in tone as Morrison tried to get someone, anyone, to authorize the transfer of assets to proper authorities. Requests denied due to budget constraints. Transfers delayed pending review. Forms misfiled or lost. Red tape wrapping around red tape until the whole thing strangled itself into bureaucratic paralysis. Morrison's final letter, dated February 1973, was addressed to his commanding officer and marked urgent in red ink that had faded to pink. Marcus read it by flashlight. Morrison's frustration bleeding through every word. "Sir, I am writing to formally protest the indefinite delay of the Section 7 asset transfer. These items represent cultural heritage of immense significance. We have documented provenance for most items, including identification of original owners or their descendants. The longer we delay, the more difficult repatriation becomes. I have personally documented everything to ensure the historical record is preserved. But documentation alone is not enough. These assets need to be properly transferred to institutions that can protect them and return them to rightful claimants. I strongly urge immediate action. Respectfully, Captain James Morrison." There was no record of a response. 2 weeks later, according to a personnel file Marcus found, Captain Morrison had been transferred to another posting. Section 7 operations had been terminated. The island had been slated for decommissioning, and the treasure, the heritage, the carefully documented collection of war-seized assets, had been sealed in its vaults and forgotten. Until now. Until Marcus Reed, disabled veteran and island owner, had stumbled into a secret that powerful people had let slip through the cracks of bureaucracy and time. He spent another hour going through the files, photographing everything, taking notes, trying to understand the full scope. There were items from Germany, mostly artwork and ceremonial objects seized from Nazi officials. Items from Japan, primarily gold and jewelry taken during occupation. Items from Italy, from occupied territories, from a dozen countries caught in the machinery of global conflict. Some had clear ownership, family names attached, addresses, documentation of theft. Others were more ambiguous, seized from enemy combatants whose own claims to ownership were questionable. But all of it was here, catalogued. While the families who'd lost these pieces moved on or died, still wondering what had happened to their grandmother's necklace or their museum's stolen painting or their synagogue's ceremonial objects. Marcus checked his watch. 2:30. He needed to get back to the dock, needed to meet Cal, needed to get off this island and figure out what the hell to do with this information that was suddenly burning a hole in his mind, as surely as the key was burning a hole in his pocket. He carefully repacked the most important documents, taking the ledger, the maps, Morrison's letters, and several of the photographic catalogs. The rest would stay here, safe in this bunker that had protected them for 50 years. He'd come back, would document everything properly. He would figure out how to handle this revelation that had just turned his $75,000 investment into something he couldn't begin to calculate. The climb back through the tunnel, back through Building 7, back across the island to the dock, felt longer than it should have, weighted with knowledge that seemed to press down on his shoulders like physical mass. Marcus kept replaying everything in his mind, kept trying to convince himself he hadn't imagined it, hadn't somehow hallucinated an entire underground vault system and documentation of forgotten war treasure. Cal was already waiting when Marcus reached the dock, the fishing boat idling just offshore, the old fisherman checking his watch with the impatience of someone who had a schedule to keep and wasn't fond of tardiness. "Find anything interesting?" Cal asked as Marcus climbed aboard, wincing as his bad leg protested the step down into the rocking boat. Marcus looked back at the island, at the rusted battleship hulls and crumbling concrete, and the secrets buried beneath it all. For a moment he considered telling Cal everything, unloading this burden onto someone else, sharing the weight. But something held him back. Caution, maybe. Or the Marine Corps instinct to protect sensitive information until you knew who could be trusted. Or maybe just the overwhelming sense that once he spoke this secret out loud, everything would change in ways he couldn't control. "Yeah," he said carefully, settling onto the worn bench seat and clutching his backpack full of documents like it was a life preserver. "I think I found something important. I'm just not sure what to do about it yet." Cal gave him a long look, the kind of look that said he'd been around enough to know when someone was holding back, but also respected a man's right to his own counsel. "Well," Cal said finally, pushing the throttle forward and pointing the boat back toward the mainland. "Whatever it is, you be careful with it. Things that get forgotten usually get forgotten for a reason. And sometimes that reason is that remembering them causes trouble." Marcus nodded, watching the island recede behind them, growing smaller against the grey water and greyer sky. The mist was rolling back in, beginning to hide the island again, to wrap it in secrecy and silence. He thought about Captain Morrison, about a man who'd tried to do the right thing and been swallowed by bureaucracy. He thought about the families still searching for lost heritage. He thought about his daughter, Riley, who was counting on him to have made a smart investment and not a catastrophically stupid one. And he thought about the vaults, still sealed, still waiting, full of treasure and history and responsibility. By the time they reached the mainland, as Cal tied off the boat and Marcus stepped onto solid ground with relief his leg could feel in every nerve, he'd made a decision. He couldn't do this alone. He couldn't unseal those vaults by himself, couldn't determine what should be returned and to whom, couldn't navigate the legal and historical implications of what he'd found. He needed help, real help. And there was only one person he trusted enough to tell the full truth. That evening, after Riley got home from school, after they'd eaten dinner that neither of them really tasted, because Marcus was too distracted and Riley could tell something was wrong, he sat her down at the kitchen table and spread out everything he'd found. The maps, the photographs, the ledger with its impossible numbers, Morrison's desperate letters. "Dad," Riley whispered after reading for 20 minutes in growing silence, her young face cycling through disbelief and shock, and something like awe. "This is insane. This is like movie-level insane. This is National Treasure Nicolas Cage insane." "I know," Marcus said. She looked up at him, her mother's eyes wide and clear. "What are we going to do?" Marcus felt something in his chest loosen at that word. "We. Not you, but we." His daughter, 16 years old, already understanding that this was bigger than money, bigger than ownership, bigger than their small lives in their small town. "I don't know yet," he admitted, reaching across the table to take her hand. "But whatever we do, we're going to do it right. Captain Morrison tried to protect this stuff for the people it belongs to. We're going to finish what he started." Riley squeezed his hand back. And in that moment, Marcus Reed knew that finding the treasure wasn't the discovery that mattered. The real discovery was remembering what it meant to have purpose, to serve something larger than yourself, to honor the past while building something better for the future. The vaults could wait one more night. Tomorrow, he'd start making calls. Tomorrow, he'd begin the process of turning his $75,000 gamble into something that honored both the treasure itself and the man who'd tried so hard to protect it. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, sitting with his daughter in their small kitchen, holding the evidence of history forgotten and about to be remembered, Marcus Reed felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Marcus had first descended into the vaults. It was slipped under his front door while he and Riley were having breakfast, while they were still pretending life was normal, even though everything had changed. Plain white envelope, no return address, no stamp, just his name written in block letters that looked like they'd been traced with a ruler to disguise the handwriting. Marcus almost threw it away with the coupon mailers and grocery store flyers, but something about the weight of it, the deliberate anonymity, made him pause. He opened it standing in the doorway, morning light spilling across the threshold, and felt ice settle in his stomach as he read the single typed sentence centered on white paper. Walk away while you still can. No signature, no explanation, just those 6 words that managed to be both vague and crystal clear in their meaning. Someone knew. Someone was watching. And someone wasn't happy about what Marcus had found beneath 12 acres of rusted metal and forgotten history. Riley looked up from her cereal, her spoon frozen halfway to her mouth, and Marcus realized his face must have betrayed something because her expression shifted from teenage boredom to immediate concern. "Dad, what's that?" "Nothing," he said too quickly, folding the letter and tucking it into his pocket, where it seemed to burn against his leg like evidence of his own stupidity. "Just spam. Some company wanting me to refinance or something." She didn't believe him. He could tell by the way her eyes narrowed, but she was 16 and had learned when to push and when to let things slide. "Okay," she said slowly. "But if it's not nothing, you know you can tell me, right? We're in this together." Marcus forced a smile that felt like cracking glass. "I know, sweetheart. I promise. It's fine." But it wasn't fine, and it got less fine with every passing day. The second warning came 3 days later, this time at the harbor where Cal kept his boat. Marcus had called to arrange another trip to the island. Needed to photograph more of the vault contents. Needed to continue the documentation process he'd started. But when he arrived at the marina just after dawn, he found Cal standing on the dock, his weathered face red with anger that made the veins in his temples stand out like tributaries on a map. "Someone sabotaged her," Cal said, without preamble, gesturing at his boat sitting low in the water, the stern noticeably lower than it should have been. "Cut the fuel lines, pulled the drain plugs. If I'd started her up without checking, if I'd gotten out to deep water before noticing, she would have sunk and taken me with her." Marcus felt his chest tighten, felt his hands start to shake with the kind of adrenaline response he hadn't experienced since Afghanistan, since the day the IED had turned his convoy into chaos and his leg into a medical emergency. "When did this happen?" "Sometime last night," Cal said, his anger giving way to something that looked disturbingly like fear. "Marinas got cameras, but they were spray-painted over around midnight. Whoever did this knew what they were doing, knew exactly how to disable a boat without it being obvious, until it was too late." He looked at Marcus, hard, really looked at him. "What the hell did you find out there, Marcus? What's worth killing someone over?" Marcus wanted to lie, wanted to protect Cal from whatever this was spiraling into, but the old fisherman deserved the truth, or at least part of it. "Something valuable," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was in earshot. "Something that apparently some people don't want found. I'm sorry, Cal. I never meant to drag you into this." Cal spat into the water, a gesture that somehow conveyed both disgust and acceptance. "I've been running this boat for 40 years, served in the Navy before that, survived things that should have killed me more than once. I don't scare easy. He paused, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wasn't sure he should spit out. But whoever did this, they're serious. They're not just trying to scare you, Marcus. They're willing to hurt people, maybe kill them, to get what they want. You need to be careful. You need to think about Riley. That name, his daughter's name, spoken out loud in connection with danger, hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the treasure, on the historical significance, on doing right by Captain Morrison's legacy, that he hadn't fully considered what putting himself in the crosshairs might mean for the one person he had left in the world. "I will," Marcus said, his voice rough. "I promise. I'll be careful." But being careful wasn't enough. Not when the threats kept escalating, kept getting closer, kept finding new ways to remind him that someone out there had resources and reach, and a willingness to use both. That night, Marcus installed security cameras around the rental house, cheap ones from the hardware store, but better than nothing. He changed the locks on both doors and made sure Riley's window had a wooden dowel jammed in the track so it couldn't be opened from outside. He slept with his service pistol on the nightstand, something he hadn't done since the nightmares had finally started to fade, since he'd convinced himself the war was behind him and not waiting around every corner. He called the lawyer Catherine Vance had recommended, spent 3 hours on the phone explaining everything, sent encrypted copies of all the documents he'd found. She'd been excited at first, seeing dollar signs and historical significance and a case that would make her career. But as he explained about the letters, about Cal's boat, about the feeling of being watched every time he stepped outside, her enthusiasm had dampened into something more cautious. "Marcus, we need to move fast," she'd said, her bourbon-smooth voice carrying an edge of urgency. "Someone is trying to tie this up before it becomes public, before anyone can establish your legal claim. I'm filing paperwork today to document your ownership and claim to the assets. But you need to understand, the moment this becomes official, the moment it hits any kind of public record, you're going to face challenges from multiple directions." "What kind of challenges?" Marcus had asked, though part of him already knew. "The federal government will want it back. Claim it was never properly decommissioned, or that the sale didn't include subsurface assets. Foreign governments may claim stolen property. And then there are the private interests. People who've been keeping this quiet, for their own reasons. People who don't want questions asked about how treasure worth hundreds of millions just disappeared from government records. You're saying there's a cover-up. I'm saying that something this valuable doesn't just get forgotten by accident. Someone, somewhere, made sure it stayed buried. And now you've dug it up." That conversation had been 5 days ago. Since then, Marcus had barely slept, jumping at every sound, checking on Riley 3 times a night to make sure she was still safely in her bed, still breathing, still untouched by whatever darkness he'd apparently awakened. He'd called her school, given them strict instructions that only he, or people he specifically authorized, could pick her up, gave them a list of warning signs, and told them to call the police if anyone suspicious came around. Riley, for her part, had handled it better than he'd expected, though he could see the strain in her eyes, the way she checked over her shoulder now when walking home, the way she'd started keeping her phone charged at all times and within reach. They'd had the conversation, the serious one, where Marcus had explained that sometimes doing the right thing meant painting a target on your back, where he'd offered to send her to stay with her aunt in California until this was resolved. She'd refused. "I'm not leaving you, Dad," she'd said with the kind of stubborn determination that reminded him painfully of her mother. "We're in this together, remember? You don't get to protect me by pushing me away." The injunction came on a Friday afternoon, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic as he handed Marcus the legal documents. Someone had filed a federal motion to halt any further activity on the island, claiming it was a hazardous site, requiring government remediation before any assets could be moved or documented. The paperwork was sophisticated, layered with legal language Marcus could barely parse, backed by environmental surveys and safety assessments that had apparently been conducted without him knowing anyone was even on his property. Catherine called an hour after he'd sent her photos of the injunction. "This is coming through a shell corporation," she said, and Marcus could hear her typing furiously in the background. "They're hiding behind layers of legal entities. But the paperwork is too good, too fast, too expensive for this to be anything other than someone with serious resources trying to tie your hands. Can they do this?" Marcus asked, pacing his small living room while Riley watched from the couch, her homework forgotten, her face pale with worry. "They're doing it. The injunction is temporary, but it'll take weeks to fight, maybe months. And in that time, they'll probably try something else, some other legal maneuver to either force you to sell or make accessing the vaults impossible." "Why not just steal it?" Marcus asked. "If they know what's down there, why go through all this legal theater? Why not just break in and take it?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Because if they steal it, they can't legitimize ownership. Whatever they want from those vaults, they need it to look legal. Which means they need you either out of the picture or convinced to sell." That night, after Riley had gone to bed, after Marcus had checked the locks for the third time and tested the security cameras to make sure they were recording, he sat at the kitchen table and tried to understand who he was fighting. Someone with money, clearly. Someone with legal resources and connections. Someone who knew about the treasure, which meant either they had access to old military records or they were connected to whoever had hidden it in the first place. He pulled out the documents he'd found, Morrison's letters and the manifests and the photographs, and started reading more carefully, looking for clues he might have missed. Most of it was straightforward. Military documentation of assets seized during wartime. But as he dug deeper, as he cross-referenced names and dates and transfer orders, a pattern began to emerge that made his blood run cold. Multiple items on the manifest, particularly the highest value pieces, had passed through the hands of the same supply officer during their journey from seized property to Section 7 storage. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Pierce, attached to military procurement, Pacific Theater, 1945 through 1948. His signature appeared on dozens of transfer documents, always as the receiving officer, always with notations like pending final disposition or held for authentication. Marcus Googled the name, found multiple hits. Richard Pierce had gone on to have a distinguished career, retiring as a full colonel in 1963. After retirement, he'd founded Pierce Maritime Solutions, a military contracting company that had grown wealthy during the Cold War, providing logistics support to naval operations. The company still existed, now run by his grandson, Donovan Pierce, a businessman in his 50s with political connections and a family fortune estimated in the hundreds of millions. The same family fortune that had mysteriously grown exponentially in the years following World War II, growing from a modest military pension to a shipping empire almost overnight, funded by assets whose origin nobody had ever questioned too closely. Because in the chaos of post-war reconstruction, fortunes were made and lost and made again, and who had time to audit every transaction when the world was rebuilding itself? Marcus sat back, the pieces clicking together with a clarity that made him feel sick. Colonel Pierce hadn't just processed these assets. He'd diverted them, skimmed the best pieces, sold them quietly through channels that didn't ask questions. The items that ended up in Section 7 storage weren't everything that had been seized. They were what was left after Pierce had taken his cut. A cut that had apparently funded an entire family dynasty. And now that Marcus had found the storage facility, now that he had documentation proving what had been stored there and what should have been returned to rightful owners, he represented a threat to the Pierce family's carefully constructed legitimacy. If the treasure came to light, if historians started asking questions about provenance and chain of custody, someone might wonder where the rest of it had gone. Someone might start digging into how a supply officer had retired with enough money to start a shipping empire. The Pierce family didn't want the treasure because they needed the money. They wanted it because they needed it to stay hidden, needed the questions it might raise to stay unasked, needed the past to stay buried where it couldn't threaten the present. Marcus was still sitting at the kitchen table, the awful clarity of understanding washing over him, when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He almost didn't open it, but something made him click. The message was simple. A photograph of Riley walking home from school, taken from across the street, close enough to show her face clearly, close enough to make the threat unmistakable. Below the photo, just 3 words. Walk away. Now. Marcus's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the phone. He stood up fast enough to knock his chair over, moved to Riley's door, and opened it quietly, needing to see her sleeping safely, needing visual confirmation that she was okay, that the photo had been taken earlier, that whoever sent it hadn't already made good on their implicit threat. She was there, safe, breathing steadily, her phone charging on the nightstand, her homework still spread across her desk. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching his daughter sleep, feeling the rage and fear war inside his chest. This had gone beyond threats to him, beyond sabotaged boats and legal maneuvers. They'd threatened Riley. They'd made it clear that his family wasn't off limits, that nothing was sacred, that they would hurt a 16-year-old girl to protect their secrets. He closed her door quietly and called Catherine Vance. Didn't care that it was past midnight. Didn't care that he probably sounded half crazy as he explained about the photo, about the Pierce connection, about the realization that he wasn't just fighting for treasure, but against a family that had spent 70 years covering up what might be the largest case of wartime theft in American history. Marcus, listen to me, Catherine said, her voice sharp with an urgency that cut through his panic. You need to call the police right now. Report the threat. Get it documented. Then you need to contact the FBI. The FBI, Marcus repeated, pacing his small living room, unable to stand still, unable to calm the adrenaline that was screaming through his system. Yes, what you're describing isn't just assault or intimidation. If the Pierce family diverted war-seized assets, if they've been covering it up for decades, that's federal crime territory. Mail fraud, wire fraud, theft of government property, conspiracy. And if they're threatening you now, threatening your daughter to cover it up, that's obstruction and witness intimidation. But I don't have proof, Marcus said. I have documents showing what was in the storage facility, But I don't have proof Pierce stole anything. Just my theory, based on his signature and his family's convenient wealth. You have enough to warrant an investigation, Catherine said firmly. And you have evidence of active threats, which means you have grounds for protective custody if needed. Marcus, these people have already sabotaged a boat and threatened your child. This is past the point where you can handle it quietly. You need federal intervention. Marcus looked at his daughter's closed door, thought about the photo on his phone, thought about Captain Morrison, who'd tried to do the right thing and been transferred away. His warnings ignored, his careful documentation abandoned to gather dust for 50 years. He thought about the families who'd lost their heritage to wartime theft, who'd spent decades wondering what happened to their grandmother's jewelry or their synagogue's ceremonial objects. Families who had a right to know that someone had stolen from them twice. Once during the war, and again in its aftermath, when the people supposed to protect and return, their property had helped themselves instead. Okay, Marcus said quietly. I'll call them in the morning, but what do I do tonight? How do I keep Riley safe right now? Pack a bag, Catherine said. Both of you. And get to a hotel, somewhere these people can't find you easily. Pay cash if you can, use a fake name. I know that sounds paranoid. But Marcus, you're dealing with people who have money, connections, and apparently no ethical boundaries. Until we get federal protection in place, you need to disappear. They left the house at 1 a.m, Marcus waking Riley gently, keeping his voice calm even though his hands were shaking, explaining that they needed to go, that it wasn't safe to stay, that he'd explain everything in the car. To her credit, she didn't argue, didn't demand explanations, just threw clothes in a backpack and grabbed her laptop and followed him to the truck, her trust in him absolute, despite the fear he could see in her eyes. They drove for 40 minutes, checking the rearview mirror obsessively, finally stopping at a motel on the edge of the next town over, the kind of place that accepted cash and didn't look too closely at the name you wrote in the register. The room was small and smelled like cigarette smoke imperfectly covered by cheap air freshener, but it had locks on the door and windows that overlooked the parking lot and didn't connect to any other rooms. Riley sat on the bed that wasn't quite big enough to be a double, hugging her backpack, and looked at her father with eyes that seemed too old for 16. Dad, what's happening? And don't tell me it's nothing. Because nothing doesn't make us run away in the middle of the night. So Marcus told her everything. About the Pierce family. About the theory of wartime theft. About the photo someone had sent. About the realization that the people threatening them weren't just after treasure, but were covering up crimes that stretched back 70 years. He showed her the photo on his phone, watched her face go pale as she recognized herself, recognized the threat. They took my picture, she said quietly, her voice small in a way that broke Marcus's heart. They were watching me, and I didn't even know. I'm sorry, Marcus said, sitting beside her, putting his arm around her thin shoulders. I'm so sorry, Riley. I never thought this would put you in danger. I thought I was just documenting history, doing the right thing. But I didn't think about what happened when you threaten powerful people with exposure. She was quiet for a long moment. And when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, carrying an edge of her mother's steel that Marcus remembered, from arguments about principles and doing what was right, even when it was hard. We can't let them win, Dad. If we walk away now, if we let them scare us into silence, then Captain Morrison tried to protect that treasure for nothing. All those families who are still looking for their stolen heritage, they'll never know. The Pierce family will keep their dirty money and their respectability, and nobody will ever know they built it all on theft. Riley, they threatened you, Marcus said. They sent me a photo of you walking home from school. That's not just intimidation. That's a promise of what they're willing to do. I can't risk you. Not for treasure. Not for anything. It's not about treasure, though, is it? Riley said, looking at him with eyes that saw too much, understood too deeply. It's about telling the truth. It's about standing up to bullies who think money means they can do whatever they want. Mom used to say that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. I think this is one of those times. Marcus felt tears prick his eyes, felt the weight of his daughter's courage and the impossible choice it presented. Walk away and keep her safe, but let injustice win. Or push forward and risk everything, but maybe, just maybe, do something that mattered. He thought about the elderly woman he'd seen in photographs during his research, the one who'd been searching for her family's stolen menorah for 70 years. He thought about Captain Morrison, trying so hard to do right by people he'd never met, spending his last days at Section 7, documenting everything because he knew the system was failing and wanted to leave a record that might someday matter. He thought about the values he'd tried to instill in Riley, about service and honor, and standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. Okay, he said finally, quietly. We'll see this through, but we do it smart, and we do it with help. In the morning, I'm calling the FBI like Catherine said. We let them handle the investigation. Let them provide protection. We don't try to be heroes. We just tell the truth and let the law handle the rest. Riley nodded, leaning against him, and Marcus held his daughter in a motel room that smelled like failure and cigarettes, and promised himself that no matter what happened, no matter who came after them or what threats they made, he would keep her safe, even if it meant giving up everything, even if it meant walking away from the treasure and the legacy and the sense of purpose he'd found. Riley came first, always. The next morning, as grey light filtered through cheap curtains and traffic noise from the highway, provided a soundtrack of normal life continuing despite everything, Marcus made the call. The FBI field office in Seattle connected him to a special agent, Rebecca Torres, who listened without interrupting as Marcus explained everything. The purchase of the island, the discovery of the vaults, the documentation he'd found, the escalating threats, the Pierce family connection, the photo of his daughter. Mr. Reed, Agent Torres said when he'd finished, her voice professional but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been excitement. I'm going to need you to come in today. Bring everything you have, every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence. What you're describing could be one of the largest cases of wartime asset theft we've ever investigated. And if the Pierce family is threatening witnesses to cover it up, that gives us grounds to move immediately. Will Riley be safe? Marcus asked. The only question that really mattered. We'll make sure of it, Torres said firmly. I'm arranging protective custody as we speak. You and your daughter will be in a safe location by tonight. And Mr. Reed, thank you for coming forward. A lot of people would have taken that photo as a reason to run and never look back. It takes courage to stand up to people like this. Marcus looked at Riley, who'd been listening to his side of the conversation, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. It's not courage, he said quietly. It's just doing what's right. Someone should have done it 70 years ago, but better late than never, I guess. After the call ended, as they packed up their few belongings to drive to Seattle, to start the process of turning his discovery over to federal authorities, and hoping they'd provide the protection Catherine had promised. Marcus stood at the motel window looking out at the parking lot and the highway beyond and thought about how far he'd come from that auction room where everyone had laughed at the sucker buying a floating scrapyard. He'd been searching for purpose, for meaning, for something that mattered. He'd found it, but not the way he'd expected. Not in the treasure itself, but in the choice to protect it, to honor the people it belonged to stand against those who'd profited from theft and tried to keep it buried. The road ahead would be hard. He knew that. The Pierce family had resources, connections, lawyers who would fight every step. There would be trials and testimony, and probably more threats. More attempts to silence him, or discredit him, or make him disappear into the kind of tragic accident that left questions nobody bothered to ask. But Marcus Reed had survived Afghanistan, had survived losing his wife, had survived years of thinking he had nothing left to give and nothing worth fighting for. He'd bought an island everyone called worthless and found treasure everyone had forgotten. And now, with his daughter beside him and federal agents finally listening, he was going to make sure that treasure went where it belonged, that the truth came out, that the Pierce family answered for 70 years of lies built on the grief of families who'd lost everything. Sometimes, he thought as they climbed into his truck and headed toward Seattle, and whatever came next, the most valuable thing you can find isn't gold or jewels or historical artifacts. It's the courage to do what's right, even when powerful people want you silent. Even when the easy path is walking away. Even when everything in you screams that you're just one person against impossible odds. Captain Morrison had tried. He'd failed, defeated by bureaucracy and indifference, and a system that had let his warnings go unheeded. But Marcus wouldn't fail. Not while he had breath. Not while he had his daughter's courage to inspire him. Not while there were families still searching for the heritage that had been stolen twice over. The treasure was real. The danger was real. But so was the truth, and Marcus Reed was done letting it stay buried. The federal courthouse in downtown Seattle was packed the morning the hearings began. Camera crews lining the marble steps like soldiers at attention. Protesters holding signs that ranged from supportive to accusatory. Everyone having an opinion about the disabled veteran who'd bought an island and found a fortune. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with the particular energy that comes when history is being made in real time. When the outcome of a single case might ripple outward in ways nobody could fully predict. Lawyers in expensive suits shuffled papers and whispered urgently to clients. Journalists filled the gallery, notebooks ready. And somewhere in the middle of it all sat Marcus Reed, wearing the only suit he owned, the one from his wife's funeral, feeling completely out of his depth, but determined to see this through. Catherine Vance sat beside him, her briefcase open and overflowing with documents that had taken 3 months to organize into something resembling a coherent, legal argument. Across the aisle sat 5 different legal teams, representing interests that seemed to multiply every time Marcus checked. The federal government claiming the assets had never been properly decommissioned, the Pierce family insisting through their lawyers that they had no knowledge of any impropriety. 3 foreign governments requesting repatriation of cultural heritage, and a coalition of museums and historical societies arguing for preservation and public access. In the gallery behind Marcus, Riley sat in the front row, missing school but refusing to be anywhere else, her hand occasionally reaching forward to squeeze her father's shoulder when the weight of it all seemed too heavy. Agent Rebecca Torres sat beside her, no longer in an official capacity but as a friend, someone who'd spent the last 3 months helping Marcus navigate the impossible maze of federal investigation and legal proceedings and threats that had continued right up until Donovan Pierce was arrested 3 weeks ago. Judge Margaret Holloway entered with the kind of presence that made everyone stand automatically. A woman in her 60s, with iron gray hair, and a reputation that preceded her like a force of nature. She'd been on the bench for 40 years, had presided over everything from mob trials to environmental disasters, and she did not suffer fools or waste time on theatrics. "This court is now in session," she said, her gavel coming down with a crack that silenced the murmuring crowd. "And let me be clear from the start. I've reviewed the preliminary filings, and this is one of the most complex property and historical claims cases I've seen in 4 decades. We're going to proceed methodically and factually. Emotions are high on all sides, but the law is the law. Let's begin." What followed was 3 weeks of testimony that felt like watching someone excavate a grave, layer by layer, revealing bones that some people desperately wanted to stay buried. Historians took the stand and detailed the provenance of items in the vault, tracing ceremonial objects back to specific families, artwork to specific museums, gold to specific wartime seizures. Their voices were academic, but their findings were damning, showing over and over that items which should have been returned had instead been diverted, lost in paperwork, forgotten in ways that suggested intention rather than accident. Forensic accountants traced money flows through shell corporations and offshore accounts, connecting the Pierce family's post-war fortune to the exact time period when Section 7 assets should have been transferred, but mysteriously weren't. They showed patterns of wealth accumulation that didn't match legitimate business growth, showed purchases that coincided with documented art sales in the private market, showed a paper trail that suggested Colonel Richard Pierce hadn't just processed these assets, he'd treated them like his personal retirement fund. FBI agents testified about the attack on Marcus, about Cal's sabotaged boat, about the threatening letters and the photo of Riley walking home from school. They presented phone records connecting Donovan Pierce to known criminals who specialized in intimidation and evidence tampering. They showed emails discussing asset retrieval and problem elimination in language that was carefully coded but ultimately transparent in its intent. And then came the families. That's when the courtroom stopped feeling like a legal proceeding and started feeling like something else entirely, like bearing witness to grief that had waited 70 years for acknowledgement. An elderly woman named Sarah Goldberg took the stand with the help of a walker, her hands shaking as she held a photograph of her grandparents standing in front of their synagogue in Prague in 1941. She was 87 years old, one of the few survivors of her entire extended family. And when Dr. Chen held up the photograph of the menorah found in Marcus's vault, the one that matched records from her family's synagogue, Sarah Goldberg wept openly. "They took everything from us," she said, her voice breaking on every word, accent still carrying traces of the Czechoslovakia she'd fled as a child. "Our home, our business, our family. My grandparents died in Auschwitz. My parents died searching for anything that was left. Any piece of our history they could give to me so I would remember where I came from. And this," she pointed at the menorah photograph, "this was lit every Friday night in our home for 6 generations. I thought it was gone forever. I thought they'd destroyed it or melted it down, or that it was sitting in some Nazi's house being used by people who murdered my family. Judge Holloway had to call a recess. Half the courtroom was crying, including 2 of the jurors who'd been selected to advise on the asset distribution. Marcus sat with his head in his hands, feeling the weight of it, understanding in a way he hadn't fully grasped before that this wasn't about treasure or money or even justice in the abstract sense. This was about human beings who'd had their history stolen and had spent entire lifetimes wondering what happened to the physical pieces of their heritage. A Japanese woman named Keiko Yamamoto testified about the jade collection that had belonged to her great-grandmother, pieces that had been in her family for 8 generations before being seized during occupation. A French priest described the painting stolen from his church, a Madonna and Child, by a minor Renaissance artist that wasn't worth millions but was priceless to the small village that had commissioned it in 1542. A Polish historian detailed ceremonial objects from a castle that no longer existed, burned by retreating armies. The objects in Marcus's vault, the only proof the place had ever been real. Each story built on the last, creating a tapestry of loss and longing that made the Pierce family's lawyers look increasingly uncomfortable, and made Donovan Pierce himself, sitting rigid in his expensive suit, look like exactly what he was. A man who'd inherited a fortune built on other people's grief, and had tried to keep it quiet through threats and violence. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, Catherine coached him carefully. "Just tell the truth," she'd said. "Tell them why you bought the island, what you found, and most importantly, why you came forward instead of keeping quiet." Marcus took the stand, feeling like an imposter. A disabled veteran who'd stumbled into something way over his head and was now expected to speak with authority about historical artifacts and international law and moral obligations. Judge Holloway looked at him with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been skepticism. He couldn't tell. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice softer than when she'd addressed the lawyers, "I've read your deposition and reviewed the evidence you provided to federal authorities. But I want to hear from you directly. You purchased this island for $75,000. Discovered assets worth potentially hundreds of millions, and instead of keeping quiet or selling them off piecemeal, you contacted lawyers and historians, and ultimately the FBI. Why?" Marcus took a breath, thought about everything that had led him here, thought about Captain Morrison's desperate letters and Sarah Goldberg's tears and his own daughter's courage. "Your Honor, I was a Marine for 12 years, served 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED ended my career. When I came home, I was lost. My wife had died, my body was broken, and I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. I bought that island because I thought maybe fixing something broken would help me feel less broken." He paused, swallowing hard. "But what I found wasn't just treasure. It was history. It was heritage that belonged to people, to families, to communities, and I was raised with a code. The Marine Corps drilled it into me over 12 years. Honor, courage, commitment. Those aren't just words, they're principles. And the most important one, the one that matters more than anything else, is that you serve something bigger than yourself. You protect people who can't protect themselves." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the journalists had stopped typing. "Captain Morrison tried to do that 70 years ago," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "He tried to make sure these assets got returned to their rightful owners, and the system failed him. It failed all those families who've been searching. I couldn't let it fail again. Not when I had the evidence, Not when I had the chance to make it right. The treasure isn't mine. It never was. It belongs to Mrs. Goldberg and her grandparents' memory. It belongs to Miss Yamamoto's family. It belongs to history. And if keeping it meant becoming like the people who stole it in the first place, then it wasn't worth keeping. Judge Holloway looked at him for a long moment, and Marcus thought he saw something like approval in her eyes. Mr. Reed, I want to commend you. You could have handled this many different ways, most of them more profitable for you personally. Instead, you chose honor over expedience. The law rewards that. When Donovan Pierce took the stand, the tone shifted dramatically. His lawyers had prepared him well. He was polished and confident, denying everything with the smooth assurance of someone who'd spent his entire life believing money could buy any outcome. He denied ordering attacks, denied knowing about the treasure's exact location, denied that his grandfather had done anything improper. Everything was coincidence or misunderstanding or the overzealous interpretation of ambiguous documents. But Catherine Vance was ready. She'd spent 3 months building an airtight case, and she dismantled Pierce's testimony piece by piece, presenting documents showing Colonel Pierce had signed off on asset transfers that never reached their destinations, financial records, proving the Pierce family wealth had grown exponentially during the exact years when Section 7 assets should have been distributed, emails between Donovan and contractors who specialized in problems that need discrete solutions. By the time Catherine finished, Donovan Pierce looked less like a distinguished businessman and more like someone watching his carefully constructed life collapse in real time. His lawyers requested a recess, probably to discuss plea bargains, probably realizing that fighting this was going to destroy whatever reputation they had left. The trial lasted 4 weeks total. Judge Holloway took 3 days to deliberate, and when she called everyone back into the courtroom, the tension was thick enough to cut with one of the ceremonial swords they'd catalogued from the vaults. "This has been an extraordinary case," Judge Holloway began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. "On one hand, we have Mr. Reed, who purchased property legally, discovered assets through no fault of his own, and has cooperated fully with authorities at considerable personal risk. On the other hand, we have families seeking return of property that was unjustly taken from them, nations requesting repatriation of cultural heritage, and substantial evidence of criminal activity spanning 7 decades. She looked directly at Marcus. "Mr. Reed, I want to personally commend you for the integrity you've shown throughout this process. Many people in your position would have chosen differently, chosen personal gain over principle. You did not, and that matters." End quote. What happens next will transform not just Marcus's life but the lives of countless others, reveal the true meaning of treasure, and remind us why sometimes the greatest wealth comes from what we give away rather than what we keep. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. She shuffled her papers, and the courtroom held its collective breath. Therefore, this court rules as follows. Mr. Reed retains full ownership of the island property and any assets whose ownership cannot be definitively established through historical documentation. However, all items with clear provenance to families, institutions, or nations will be returned to their rightful owners or their legal descendants. Mr. Reed will receive a finder's fee of 10% of the appraised value of returned items, to be paid by a restitution fund established specifically for this purpose and funded through the seizure of Pierce family assets, proven to have been obtained illegally. She paused, letting that sink in. Additionally, the federal government will reimburse Mr. Reed for all security, legal, and documentation costs incurred during this process. The government failed in its duty to protect these assets and to return them appropriately. Mr. Reed has done the work the government should have done 50 years ago, and he deserves compensation for that service. Another pause, this one heavier. As for the Pierce family and Pierce Maritime Solutions, there is sufficient evidence to warrant criminal charges, including conspiracy to commit theft, fraud, obstruction of justice, witness, intimidation, and accessory to assault. The U.S. Attorney's Office will proceed with prosecution. Additionally, all Pierce family assets proven to have been obtained through the diversion of Section 7 materials will be seized and placed in the restitution fund. The gavel came down. The courtroom erupted. Marcus sat stunned, trying to process what had just happened. 10% of hundreds of millions of dollars, reimbursement for costs, legal ownership of the island, the Pierce family facing criminal charges, justice, real justice, for families who'd waited 70 years. Riley threw her arms around him from behind, crying and laughing at the same time. "We won, Dad. We actually won." But Marcus didn't feel like a winner. He felt like someone who'd done what he was supposed to do. Nothing more. The real winners were the families who'd finally get pieces of their history back. The museums that would receive stolen artwork. The communities that would see their heritage honored. 3 months later, Marcus stood on the deck of a newly renovated building on his island, watching the sun set over the Pacific, and thinking about how far he'd come from that auction room where everyone had called him crazy. What had once been a crumbling battleship graveyard was now something entirely different. Something that made his chest tight with pride every time he looked at it. The main complex had been transformed into the Hollow Point Heritage and Veterans Memorial Center. A name Riley had suggested, and that felt exactly right. The largest building housed a museum displaying the history of the treasure, the families it had been returned to, and the long journey from wartime seizure through bureaucratic abandonment to eventual restitution. Visitors walked through rooms that told the story chronologically, saw photographs of items in the vaults, saw the faces of the people who'd received them back, read Captain Morrison's letters, and understood the quiet heroism of one man trying to do right in a system that wasn't designed for righteousness. A separate wing honored military service and sacrifice, with special attention to the cost of war on all sides. It didn't glorify combat or sanitize violence. It simply acknowledged that humans in uniform had fought and died and come home changed, and that their stories mattered, that their wounds, visible and invisible, deserved recognition. Marcus had worked with veteran organizations to create exhibits that focused on post-war challenges, on the difficulty of reintegration, on the silent battles that continued long after the shooting stopped. But what Marcus was most proud of, what made him feel like maybe his own struggles had meant something, was the Veterans Program. A portion of the island had been converted into a retreat and rehabilitation center where disabled veterans could come for physical therapy, mental health counseling, job training, and community. The program was fully funded by an endowment Marcus had established using his finder's fees, which had ended up being substantially more than he'd expected once all the assets were valued and returned. $18 million. That's what his 10% had come to. More money than Marcus had ever imagined having. More money than he knew what to do with. He'd kept enough to pay off the rental house and buy it outright, to set up Riley's college fund, to ensure they'd never struggle again. The rest, almost 16 million, had gone into the endowment and the renovation of the island. People had called him crazy for that too. Had said he should keep more, should set himself up for life, should think about his own future. But Marcus had learned something through this entire process. Money didn't heal what was broken inside. Purpose did. Service did. Knowing that what you did mattered, that the choices you made rippled outward and made the world incrementally better. That's what gave life meaning. The grand opening ceremony had been 2 weeks ago, and Marcus still felt overwhelmed thinking about it. Hundreds of people had come by ferry, filling the island with voices and life, transforming the place that had been silent for so long into something vibrant and purposeful. Sarah Goldberg had been there. The menorah from her family's synagogue, now on display in a museum in Prague, with her grandparents' names honored. Keiko Yamamoto had flown in from Tokyo, where her family's jade collection now resided in a special exhibit about Japanese families affected by war. The French priest had brought his entire congregation to see where the Madonna painting had been stored before it returned to their small church. Dr. Sarah Chen had given the keynote speech, talking about the importance of returning cultural heritage and honoring the past, while building better futures. Agent Torres had come, off-duty but wearing her badge with pride, telling the story of how one veteran's integrity had helped bring down a family that had profited from grief for 3 generations. Catherine Vance had been there, already working on her book about the case, already fielding offers to turn it into a documentary. And Riley had introduced her father, standing at a podium looking so much older than 16, speaking with the kind of confidence that came from surviving something hard and coming out stronger. My dad bought an island everyone said was worthless, she'd told the crowd, her voice steady and clear. He found treasure everyone said was impossible. And then he did something even more impossible. He gave it away. Not because he had to, but because it was right. That's not just integrity, that's heroism. And I'm proud to be his daughter. Marcus had cried at that, standing off to the side, trying to keep it together and failing completely. After everything they'd been through, the threats and the fear and the months of uncertainty, hearing his daughter say she was proud of him had meant more than any dollar amount or legal victory. Now, standing alone on the observation deck as evening settled over the water, Marcus heard footsteps behind him and turned to find a man approaching cautiously. He was in his 70s, wearing a Navy veteran's cap, leaning on a cane that looked remarkably similar to Marcus's own. "Mr. Reed?" the man asked. "I'm Thomas Chen, Sarah's husband. I was a sailor in the Pacific. Came home with injuries that ended my career. Spent 40 years wondering what it had all been for." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately. "It's a hard question to answer." "It is," Thomas agreed, coming to stand beside him at the railing. "But this place, what you've built here, it helps. My granddaughter brought me yesterday for the Veterans Program orientation. I'm going to be part of the first group going through therapy and job training." He paused, his voice thickening. "For the first time since 1967, I feel like maybe there's still purpose left for me. Like maybe I'm not just broken goods waiting to die." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "You were never broken goods. None of us are. We're just carrying weight that most people don't see. Sometimes we need help setting it down." They stood together in comfortable silence. 2 veterans watching the sun paint the water gold, connected by the shared understanding that came from service and sacrifice, and the long road of trying to rebuild lives after war. Eventually, Thomas nodded his thanks and headed back toward the residential building. And Marcus remained, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. A year ago, he'd been a disabled veteran stocking shelves at a hardware store, wondering if the best years of his life were already behind him, if he'd ever feel useful again. Then he'd bought an island on impulse, following some instinct he couldn't explain, and it had led him here, to purpose, to meaning, to understanding that the treasure wasn't the gold, or the artifacts, or even the finder's fee. The treasure was knowing that his actions had returned heritage to families who'd been searching for 70 years. The treasure was providing a place where veterans like Thomas could find healing and community. The treasure was watching his daughter grow into someone who understood that integrity mattered more than convenience. That service was its own reward. That sometimes you had to risk everything to do what was right. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photograph he'd saved from the museum exhibition. It showed Captain James Morrison in his uniform, standing at attention, young and earnest, and determined to serve with honor. Below the photo was a quote from one of his letters. "If we lose our integrity in the pursuit of victory, then what exactly have we won?" For 50 years, Morrison's question had gone unanswered, his careful documentation gathering dust, his warnings unheeded. But Marcus had answered it, in the only way that mattered, with action, with choosing principle over profit, with proving that even small people, even broken people, could stand against powerful interests and win if they refused to compromise on what was right. His phone buzzed with a text from Riley. "Dad, there's someone here who wants to meet you. Says his name is Morrison. Says he's Captain Morrison's grandson." Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he headed back toward the main building. Inside, he found Riley standing with a man in his 50s, tall and military straight despite civilian clothes, holding a worn leather journal. "Mr. Reed," the man said, extending his hand. "David Morrison. I'm James Morrison's grandson. I saw the news coverage of your case. Saw my grandfather's name mentioned, and I had to come see what you'd built here." Marcus shook his hand, feeling the strength in the grip. "Your grandfather was a hero. If he hadn't left those documents, hadn't kept such meticulous records, none of this would have been possible." David's eyes were bright with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. He died thinking he'd failed. Died believing that all those assets he'd tried to protect had been forgotten or stolen, that his service hadn't mattered. I was 10 when he passed, but I remember him talking about Section 7, about the weight of knowing he'd tried and failed to do right by all those families. He opened the journal, revealing pages filled with careful handwriting. This was his personal diary from those years. "I brought it because I thought you should read it, should understand how much it tore him up inside, knowing the system had failed and he couldn't fix it." Marcus took the journal carefully, as reverently as if it were a religious text. He opened to a random page, dated March 1973, and read, "Transfer orders cancelled today. They're closing Section 7 without distributing the assets. I've filed 17 formal protests, written to every commanding officer I can reach, documented everything in hopes that someday someone will care enough to make this right. But I'm being transferred, and there's nothing more I can do. God forgive us for what we're leaving undone." "He cared," Marcus said quietly, looking up at David. "He cared so much that he left a map for whoever came after him. He left clues and documentation, and a key that would open doors 50 years later. Your grandfather didn't fail. He just didn't live long enough to see his work completed. David wiped at his eyes, not bothering to hide the tears. Thank you. Thank you for finishing what he started. Thank you for proving that his integrity and his careful records and his refusal to give up mattered in the end. They talked for an hour, David sharing stories about his grandfather, Marcus explaining how each piece of documentation had been crucial in building the case. By the end, they'd agreed that Captain Morrison's personal diary would be displayed in the museum, part of the permanent exhibition, ensuring that future generations would know about the quiet officer who'd tried so hard to serve with honor. After David left, as the center closed for the evening and staff headed home, Marcus walked through the empty museum alone, his footsteps echoing off polished floors. He stopped in front of each exhibit, reading the stories, looking at the photographs of items returned, and families reunited with their heritage. He paused longest at Sarah Goldberg's section, where her photograph showed her crying and smiling at the same time, holding the menorah her grandparents had lit every Friday night, the menorah that had somehow survived camps and theft and decades of abandonment to find its way home. The plaque beneath read, Sarah Goldberg, age 87, reunited with her family's menorah after 73 years. Thanks to the integrity of veteran Marcus Reed and the meticulous documentation of Captain James Morrison, heritage that was twice stolen has been twice reclaimed. Marcus stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of it, the responsibility, and the privilege of having been part of this story. He thought about the auction where he'd raised his hand on impulse, about the moment he'd opened that vault and seen gold stacked floor to ceiling, about the choice he'd made to honor the history instead of profiting from it. Some people had called him stupid for giving away a fortune. Others had called him a saint, which was equally uncomfortable. But Marcus knew he was neither. He was just a man who'd been lost and found purpose in the most unlikely place. A man who'd learned that the truest wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts but in knowing that when faced with a moral choice, you'd chosen right. The next morning, as dawn broke over the Pacific, Marcus stood with Riley on the southern edge of the island, the same place where he'd found Building 7 and Captain Morrison's hidden records. They were dedicating a memorial statue today, bronze figures of a soldier and a sailor standing together, looking out to sea, representing all who'd served and all who'd tried to serve with honor even when the system made it hard. Dad, Riley said, leaning against his shoulder, do you ever regret it? Giving away all that money? We could have been set for life, could have traveled, could have lived in a mansion instead of our little house. Marcus thought about it seriously, considering the question she deserved a real answer to. No, he said finally, because that money wasn't really mine. It belonged to the past, to the people it was taken from. Keeping it would have been like building a house on a graveyard and wondering why I couldn't sleep at night. He squeezed her shoulder. Besides, I don't need a mansion. I have you. I have purpose. I have this place where broken people can come find healing. That's worth more than any amount of gold. Riley smiled. That quiet smile that reminded him so much of her mother. Mom would have been proud of you. You know, she always said the measure of a person isn't what they take, it's what they give. The ceremony that morning was smaller than the grand opening. Just local community members and some of the veteran program participants. But it felt more meaningful somehow, more intimate. Thomas Chen spoke about what the program had given him, about finding brotherhood and purpose after decades of isolation. A young veteran named Maria talked about how the job training had helped her transition to civilian life after 6 years in the army. An older man named Robert, who'd served in Vietnam and come home to a country that didn't want to hear his story, said simply, "This place reminds me that service mattered then and still matters now. Thank you." That evening, after everyone had gone, after Riley had headed to the mainland for a school event, Marcus found himself back in the underground chamber, where it had all started. The vaults stood empty now, their contents returned to rightful owners or transferred to museums, or, in a few cases, where ownership couldn't be determined, donated to institutions that would honor their historical significance. The chamber felt different, empty, less like a tomb and more like a place that had fulfilled its purpose. Captain Morrison had hidden treasure here because he believed someday someone would care enough to make things right. Marcus had cared, had risked everything to honor that faith. And now the space could rest, its burden lifted, its secrets told. He pulled out the compass Takeshi Kimura had given him, the one that had belonged to his grandfather, the soldier who'd lost the jade collection and never known it had been recovered. The inscription on the back read, "The path forward is found by honoring the past." Marcus understood that now in a way he hadn't a year ago. You couldn't move forward by ignoring what came before, by burying uncomfortable truths or profiting from others' pain. You moved forward by acknowledging, by making amends where possible, by choosing integrity even when expedience was easier. His phone buzzed with a text from Catherine Vance. "Netflix wants to buy the documentary rights, offering 7 figures. Interested?" Marcus typed back, "Yes, but all proceeds go to the endowment. The Veterans Program could use the funding." Her response came quickly, "You're impossible to make money for. You know that?" He smiled. "I'm rich in the ways that count. That's enough." 6 months later, the island had become something Marcus had never imagined when he'd raised his hand at that auction. The Heritage Center received visitors from around the world, people coming to see where the treasure had been hidden, to learn about the families it had been returned to understand how one veteran's integrity had sparked international restitution efforts. The Veterans Program had expanded to accommodate 50 participants at a time, with a waiting list that stretched months into the future. And Marcus, for the first time since Afghanistan, felt like he was doing work that mattered. Riley graduated high school that spring, with honors and a full scholarship to study history and museum curation, planning to spend her life ensuring that heritage and memory were protected. At her graduation party, held on the island because their small rental house couldn't fit everyone who wanted to celebrate, she gave a speech that made Marcus cry for the 100th time. "When my dad bought this island, I thought he'd lost his mind," she said to laughter from the crowd. "I mean, who spends their life savings on a pile of rust in the middle of nowhere?" But he saw what everyone else missed. He saw potential. He saw purpose. He saw an opportunity to serve something bigger than himself. She looked at him directly. "Dad, you taught me that heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. It's about choosing integrity over convenience. It's about understanding that the greatest treasures aren't the ones we keep, but the ones we give away. Thank you for that lesson. Thank you for everything." That night, after the guests had gone and the island had settled into its familiar quiet, Marcus stood on the observation deck one more time, looking out at the water that had hidden secrets for so long, and now reflected moonlight like scattered diamonds. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, about the auction and the discovery and the threats, and the choice to honor something bigger than his own needs. He thought about Captain Morrison, who'd tried and believed he'd failed, but whose careful work had made everything possible. He thought about Sarah Goldberg and Keiko Yamamoto, and all the families who'd finally found pieces of their heritage. He thought about Thomas Chen and Maria and Robert, and all the veterans who'd found community and healing in a place that had once been a symbol of abandonment and decay. And he thought about Riley, strong and principled, and ready to carry forward the lesson that service matters, that integrity counts, that broken things and broken people can be transformed into something beautiful if someone cares enough to try. Anyone can stumble upon treasure if they're willing to take a risk on forgotten places. But it takes real courage to honor what you find and give it meaning beyond yourself. As morning broke over the Pacific 1 year after that first auction, Marcus Reed stood at the entrance to the Heritage Center, watching the first ferry of the day approach with visitors and veterans and people seeking connection to history. He no longer saw himself as a disabled veteran, struggling to find purpose. He saw himself as a guardian of memory, a facilitator of healing, someone who'd been given an extraordinary gift and had chosen to share it rather than hoard it. The treasure was real. The danger had been real, but so was the truth. And Marcus had learned that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is refuse to let the truth stay buried. Refuse to let powerful people rewrite history for their own benefit. Refuse to prioritize personal gain over collective healing. He'd bought an island for $75,000 and found a fortune worth hundreds of millions. But the real fortune, the one that let him sleep peacefully at night and wake up excited for each new day, was the knowledge that he'd done right by people he'd never met, had honored a captain's desperate hopes, had created something that would outlast him and continue serving long after he was gone. Because for Marcus Reed, and for everyone his choice had touched, treasure was never about gold. It was about the courage to do right when no one was watching, the strength to protect what matters most, and the wisdom to understand that sometimes the greatest fortunes are the ones we give away. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories that will move you. Click now to continue the journey, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe courage and integrity still matter in this world.